I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. Today is Wednesday, April 8th, 2020. We're now about 2 weeks into the lockdown phase of the COVID-19 epidemic, when states and countries outside of Asia have essentially shut down their economies to try to combat the virus. I've got other episodes in the works on the long-term economic collapses we are facing, but for the most part, these are not the result of the virus. The virus was the spark that set off a big old pile of dynamite that was destined to go off anyway. Many of us predicted back in 2019 that some sort of black swan would come along in 2020 to crash the economy, but we never could have predicted such an effective and efficient black swan as the virus, something that would strike human nature in just the right way to cause maximum economic damage. In past and future episodes, I will talk about the economic and demographic dynamite that was set in place long before the virus. But for now, I want to record this short episode to explain as clearly and succinctly as I can how humanity is screwing this whole thing up, how they are totally botching and mismanaging their response to the virus, and how this is making things much worse than they had to be. Right now, most governments and individuals have one blunt, monolithic response to COVID-19, which is shut everything down. Close all non-essential businesses, send all workers home, maintain a 6-foot distance from everyone else, avoid all forms of direct contact between you and anyone outside your family. These restrictions are open-ended. There is no end date and no indication of how the shutdowns are ever going to be rolled back. It's just a blanket disabling of the economy with no end in sight. Now, I'm not saying that the shutdowns will be ineffective. I believe, in fact, that they will work. The virus will be beaten back and new cases will peak in the not-too-distant future. The problem then is dealing with the devastating effects of the shutdowns themselves, which are going to cause far more human misery than any virus. I predict the virus itself will be under control by the end of 2020, but the economic collapse that it started will go on for years and years. No foreign army could have caused more damage to our society than our own economic self-sabotage. So what's wrong with blanket lockdowns? They are blind and indiscriminate. They are conflating real threats with unlikely and imaginary ones, and they're trying to provide absolute protection for both. The ultimate solution to the COVID epidemic is reducing the major vectors. It's vitally important, for example, that people stop shaking hands. They should stop going out in public when they have a cough. They should stop touching things that 100 other people have touched without some kind of sanitation or protection. If you reduce the major vectors, that is, the things that are most likely to spread the virus, the epidemic dies out on its own because it can't reach enough victims. You do not need to eliminate every single possible vector, which is what the lockdowns are trying to do. Yes, the lockdowns are going to work and lives will be saved, but in the long run, the cure is going to be far worse than the disease. Human society cannot function without its economy, and humans seem to be doing everything in their power right now to destroy theirs. As the world economy continues its downward spiral, I wouldn't be surprised if more people died of outright starvation than die of the virus itself. It's like you have a mouse loose in the walls of your house, and this mouse is potentially deadly because its droppings cause disease. So you take a sledgehammer and you start smashing the walls wherever you hear a sound. You keep smashing and smashing, and sooner or later, by sheer luck, you're going to kill the mouse. Yes, the threat of the mouse has been neutralized, but you've destroyed your own home in the process. The effective, sustainable solution is something called a mouse trap. You've got to put yourself in the position of the mouse, understand how he behaves, then you plan a solution that will precisely target the mouse's vulnerabilities. Maybe you take a piece of cheese and you put it in a spring-loaded trap, and thereby you kill the mouse without destroying your own home. Humanity right now seems entirely incapable of this kind of foresight and strategizing. It can only blindly smash at the walls till the mouse is dead. Here's another more realistic analogy, the 9/11 attacks. Most of you remember them. 3,000 people were killed and thousands more were affected in the aerial bombing of the World Trade Center. It was a truly tragic and horrific event, but it was nowhere near as deadly or costly as the two quagmire wars the U.S. started in response. Even if you look only at the American costs in lives and trillions spent, the wars far dwarfed the costs of the original attacks. The costs multiply many-fold when you factor in the costs and suffering to the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. To be sure, these were despotic regimes at the time and deserved to fall. But after all the trillions of dollars spent and lives destroyed, you can't say that America made things better. Most importantly, you can't say that we achieved the intended goal of reducing terrorism. Yes, terrorists are no longer crashing into buildings and hijacked planes, but this goal was accomplished by simple, targeted changes in airport security. The two expensive quagmire wars did absolutely nothing to improve our security. If you lived through the post-9/11 era, you may remember just how unstoppable the call to war was. Nearly everyone in Congress voted for it. Nearly everyone in the street seemed to be in favor of it. The natural knee-jerk human reaction was that we were attacked, so we had to attack back. And it seemed that everyone in the country was on board with this. If you didn't believe the wars were a good idea, you kept your ideas to yourself because you would be labeled a traitor if you spoke out. Some entertainers were essentially blacklisted for opposing the war. Whenever you get 80 or 90% of the population supporting something with no dissent allowed, something is seriously wrong. I remember thinking at the time, this is going to end badly. You may remember the mindset of the day after 9/11. The airline network completely shut down. People used whatever means possible to get home, and then they locked themselves down there, just like they're doing today. People saw terrorists everywhere, in even the most innocuous events. Every package delivered was carefully screened for a possible bomb. Innocent people were treated as terrorists for no other crime than having foreign-looking features. If you talked in Arabic on a cell phone, you were a terrorist planning an attack. It was a really sorry time in human history. People didn't realize at the time how limited the attacks were. Terrorists with very little resources had discovered a clever loophole in security, and they exploited it. The loophole was quickly closed, and the threat instantly ended by changes in airport security. But the global damage caused by the overreaction to the threat went on for 2 decades and is still with us. If nothing else, the U.S. racked up huge debts pursuing these fruitless wars, contributing to the tragic government debt crisis I'll talk about in my next podcast. I think we are repeating the same exercise with the coronavirus. Everyone is seeing viral particles everywhere, even in places they cannot possibly exist. People are hunkering down at home as though this virus was everywhere and could do anything. Yes, the virus is insidious, as viruses go, but it can't do all the supernatural things that people's paranoid actions are implying. It's not going to get you in a state park or on a breezy beach where the nearest beachgoer is 20 feet away. It's probably not even going to get you when you're in a room talking to someone from a normal distance. It is going to get you by shaking hands, probably a major vector. You're also going to get it from touching door handles that hundreds of other people have touched. There's probably a dozen key factors that spread 90% of the disease. If you can address those major things with simple remedies, then you don't need to worry about the other 10% of the vectors, because transmission is so limited that it won't sustain itself over time. Now, as with the march to war in 2001, you are treated as a traitor today if you say anything against the lockdowns. If you try to add any nuance to it, like suggesting that one vector really isn't worth worrying about, then people get really upset. They say, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to kill my grandmother? They just aren't open to nuance. There's only one way to approach this: lock everything down, and that's the one thing that everyone can agree on. And the media is cheering all of this on. News anchors are dutifully reporting from their home instead of from the studio, as though they were contributing to the war effort. Their universal message is stay at home, no matter what the cost, trust no one, eliminate all risk. All that matters now is saving lives. Well, lives do matter, but they have to be put into perspective. Saving your civilization matters even more, and you can't have a civilization if you don't have a functioning economy where people go out and do things. If no one goes out and buys cars, your auto industry collapses and millions lose their jobs. If no one travels, vast segments of the economy fall to ruin, and they will probably never be revived. Some of the worst advice comes from medical professionals because they've been trained to eliminate all risk, no matter how slight. If you work in a hospital, you live in an environment where the aim is to eliminate every conceivable disease vector, regardless of the cost. This kind of perfect sanitation is impossible in the outside world, but doctors often don't understand that. When you see a doctor on TV recommending that healthy people wear masks in public at all times, he isn't considering the cost to society. That's not his department. He's not trained in evaluating social and economic costs. He has been trained in eliminating all forms of disease risk. Doctors live in sterile bubbles and can't be expected to understand the needs of a complex economy. I also think computer modeling of the virus is absolutely useless. A computer model is only as good as the assumptions you put into it, and the number one variable in virus distribution is human behavior. The virus is the virus. It has stable characteristics, but human behavior can change in a minute, especially if people think their lives depend on it. If everyone continued to behave exactly as they did before the virus, the computer model would tell you how things will pan out. But if people suddenly change en masse and decide, for example, not to shake hands, suddenly your computer model is useless. You get an entirely different result. With our instantaneous media, voluntary changes in behavior can sweep through society in a matter of days. But there will always be a delay in disease statistics. So the deaths in serious cases reported today may reflect human behavior 2 or 3 weeks ago, before many people were taking precautions. As widespread changes of behavior take hold, I think we're going to see a drop in cases that the computer models would have never predicted. And this success puts governments in a bind because no one will know the real cause of the drop. If they congratulate themselves and say, woohoo, our shutdown worked, then what are they going to do next? The success of the shutdown implies that if they relax it, the disease is just going to come roaring back again. On the other hand, if the drop was caused by some simple change of behavior, like not shaking hands, then the lockdown itself was irrelevant all along. It's a catch-22. If the government claims the lockdowns were successful, then they can never really be ended. But if the real success was simple behavior change, like not shaking hands, then the lockdowns were overkill to begin with, and the government would have to admit its error. So that's why there's no easy exit from lockdown mode. In the coming months, studies will probably reveal the true infectiousness of various forms of transmission. I predict that shaking hands will be found to be a major form of transmission, perhaps even the biggest. This is the reason that a disproportionate number of politicians seem to be getting the disease. Politicians shake a lot of hands. I also predict that commonly touched surfaces will turn out to be a major vector. For example, when you pull a door handle to go into a store, you're touching a surface that hundreds of other people have touched that day. And if even one of them has the virus, there's a good chance you're going to get the virus. I think that another major vector is being around a sick person. If someone who has the disease coughs in your vicinity and you breathe in the droplets that they spewed out, those droplets are going to go right where they most want to be, into the lungs. And this is probably an important vector, but it's going to require that someone be sick and cough and sneeze. There are going to be other vectors that are real, but probably not statistically significant. For example, asymptomatic transmission, where someone shows no symptoms but distributes the virus anyway. It's probably real, but I predict that it will not be seen as a major vector. To distribute the virus effectively, you need a lot of your lung cells to be infected and spewing out viral particles. Remember that a virus can't reproduce on its own. It has to co-opt and kill your body's own cells, which usually produces symptoms. So I predict it's not a big thing. I also predict that aerosolization will be seen as a trivial vector. When someone with the disease coughs in your vicinity, the risk is high that you'll breathe in his droplets. But those droplets quickly fall to earth, and you're not at risk if you're a few meters away. Aerosolization is even finer. Aerosolization refers to the virus attaching to even smaller droplets or objects in the air like dust particles and traveling long distances to reach their target. So in the aerosolization scenario, you can be walking through an airport terminal with no one around and you catch the disease just from the ambient air. I think that this possibility is way overblown, and it's the main excuse people have for not leaving home. Just breathing the air outside might kill them. While this is maybe technically possible, I predict that it will be a trivial factor that doesn't really spread much of the disease. In terms of mitigation, I suspect that many of the generally accepted lockdown rules are having only trivial effects. Studies are already beginning to show that school closings are counterproductive. If you keep kids in school, you can control them, you can manage their contact behavior, and you can train them in good hygiene practices. If you kick them out of the school, you've lost all control whatsoever. You've just let them loose on society. I suspect that the universal use of face masks by healthy people will not be proven cost effective. Yes, it will probably save a life or two, but is the benefit great enough to even justify the cost of the mask? No one is talking about that. No one is talking about cost-benefit ratios. They're just in this absolute mode of eliminating all risk, no matter how unlikely. Now, my predictions will be proven true or false over time by scientific studies. The point is there are probably only a few major vectors, and you can control them by fairly simple means, like not shaking hands. If you control the major vectors, the things that convey the most disease, then you don't need to worry about the minor ones. No one seems to be talking about this. You don't see any intelligent conversation about the cost and benefits of various mitigation methods. Right now, it's all about locking everything down, cutting everyone off, and stopping all forms of economic activity. All that seems to matter now is saving lives. The economy be damned. Well, if you would damn the economy is going to damn you.